Hello and welcome to a RackForms explainer for using custom APIs. In this particular example, we're going to be looking at Zoho CRM. Our goal here for today is to not only query existing, in this case, leads, but also be able to write them into the system. The reason why we're showing this video and specifically the technologies that you're going to see is that RackForms is actually really flexible when it comes to actually querying random APIs. We have a lot of integrations built in, but for example, in the case of Zoho CRM, we're just going to be querying the API layer directly. And then we're going to, again, be reading records out and then writing them back in. So let's take a look at how this works. So first things first, we should probably start with Zoho. You're obviously gonna need a Zoho account and an auth token in the case of Zoho. Generally speaking, when we need to query an API of some sort, there's almost always going to be a authentication process that you're going to need to use. And so it actually was years since I've used Zoho, but that was literally the first place that I started. I went to the Zoho documentation, I found this little link that says authentication token, and I immediately just started reading what it said. Now, as far as using this, the very quick version is we have two ways that we can grab an auth token. The first is we can actually query for an auth token, and the second is to just use what's called the browser mode. Now the browser mode is much easier because that just simply means we're going to use our web browser to generate tokens. The way it works is this, and it differs slightly if you've already generated one of these. Basically, you're going to go into Zoho CRM. So let's actually move this over here, grab our Zoho accounts right here. And we're going to be in our setting here. Actually, let me just close this and show you how we get there from the beginning. So I'm going to go into my setup right here, and I'm going to go in under developer space to APIs. So developer space APIs. And then we're going to go into CRM API. Now, this is the screen that actually is going to change when I click this right here, depending on if you've set up an API key yet or not. I already have, so I'm going to get this screen right here. If you have not done this yet, you're going to get a screen that essentially looks like this. And this, by the way, is where that screenshot comes in. So again, just to show you what I did right here, I was in my home area where I'm looking at my leads. I went into Setup, Developer Space APIs, and then again, if you've never set up an API before, you're going to get a screen that looks like this. If you have set up an API, to actually get to the screen where you generate a token, you need to click this little gear icon right here and go to Authentication Token Generation. When I do that, then I'm going to get a pop-up. This is what you'll see in the main window. That is right here. If you've never created it before, again, I have, so I get a slightly different screen. Basically, I'm just going to name an application, and actually, let me just show you this from the start right here. So if I actually go into my account and then active auth tokens, I can actually see the auth tokens I've created. I'm just going to delete this guy so you can see the process from scratch. But basically, I'll go in here. I'm going to name my application. In this case, I'm just going to say RackForms, easy enough. But this could be whatever client you're working for, something like that. I'm just going to click generate. It gives me this value right here. For the sake of this video, I'm actually just copying and pasting that into this little window right here. Makes it a little bit easier. Actually paste it in like that so we get some nice formatting. And that basically is it then. That then, after I've created that, is the token. Actually close this window right here. Sorry for jumping around so much, but basically that is now the token that we're going to use to make requests with. So what does making requests entail? There are lots and lots of methods that you have access to when you're using the Zoho API. I'm looking at one in particular right now, which is insert records. I can back out of this though, and we'll just go to the API layer right here, just kind of show you this from the start. Basically, if you go to API methods right here, this will be probably no different than whatever API system you're using. They're going to have method names, the purpose, and then how you actually use it. So we're going to start with get records here. And basically, you'll notice that when we want to get a record, we're going to literally use this URL right here. And the URL consists of a few parts. It's got the actual URL component. So that is literally the place that you're calling, in this case, crm.zoho.com. There's a kind of a cryptic path right here, but then importantly for us, the name of the method that we're calling. So we're calling a method called getRecords. Now we have a question mark, which means what follows are name value pairs of, in this case, configuration variables. So the first is auth token, and notice here in italic text here, it says auth token. Well, that's convenient for us because that's what we just created, was an authorization token. So my guess is we're probably going to need to put that in place of where this text is. And then finally, we have one other property, which is the scope property. We can ignore this. So in other words, the only two things that we actually care about in this particular call are the name of the method and the auth token bit right here. And so what I actually did is I took that value, and in RACforms right here, I basically pasted that in, and I replaced where it said auth token right here with literally the token that is my auth token. So if I actually go to my accounts, I'm going to copy that auth token value over, and I'm going to put it right there because that is my auth token. Now this is important because this right now is a complete API request. I can actually just copy and paste this into a browser. I can run this. It's actually going to give me a response file back, which is an XML file. And when I open this guy here, you can see that it's returned a result for me, right? These are all the leads that I currently have in the system. Now, this is using the sample data that they populated for me here, so there's nothing interesting in here. But what is interesting is that I got a response back. And more importantly, perhaps, is that this was not an error message. If you get an error message at this point, you probably didn't set up your API correctly. So again, make sure you go into your authentication token generation system. Again, if you've already done it, it's right here. Name your application and grab that authentication token. Again, if you're not sure where you grab it, it's under My Account, Active Auth Tokens, and the first screen that shows are your tokens. Now I will actually note right here, you see two of them right here. This guy, it looks like, was generated when I first set up my account in Zoho. So this guy I probably could use, but my guess is for doing third-party calls like I'm doing right here, you almost certainly need to create your own specific one and give it a description. So in other words, even if you have one of these, it probably isn't going to work. You need to probably create your own. But that said, just to be clear, I haven't actually tested that. Anyway, so point here now is now that I actually can retrieve records, how do I do it in RACforms? Well, turns out it's pretty simple. I'm going to go ahead and in my form page right here, I'm going to add under network a web service call. I get this guy right here. Then I'm going to take that same URL that I had before and just literally copy and paste it into the HTTP URL box. And then I'm actually going to set the type of request that I want. Usually post is a good type. So I'm going to select this post supports multi-part file uploads right here. And then I've written some custom response logic right here to essentially give me essentially a parsing of the document that I got back. So you note before that this is what we got when we literally just copy and pasted the link into our web browser. So we're actually going to get the exact same thing right here. Though it is important to note that when we call a request like this, we are doing the same thing that your web browser did, right? We're actually just going to go out to the URL that you asked for, we're going to return the data, and then it's up to you to actually do something with that data. Now the data itself is always held in a PHP variable called response. So notice this $response right here, very, very important. That's how we actually get that data back. Now, obviously, the type of data that you get back is going to dictate how you actually manage that data. Now, in this particular case, Zoho is returning XML to us. So to actually do something with this XML, I'm probably going to want to use something like Simple XML, which is a PHP, basically a built-in library that allows us to parse XML and then access its properties using a simple object syntax like this. Now, the type of XML that we get back here is actually kind of complicated. So it may require a little bit of trial and error to get the type of results that you want. And this is even more so considering that most APIs are actually going to return data that's meant to be looped through. So sometimes you'll find a method that allows you to get a single record. So for example, get record by ID. But in this particular case, we used get records, which means that this data is repeated for every one of the records that I have. And so it is going to take a little bit of skill to actually pluck this data out. But as an example of getting some data out right here, I basically have gone in and I've kind of parsed out the code myself, and I said that if I want to grab the first result of one of the records in a lead, I need this particular syntax right here. Just as a quick reading of this, XML is the object we created here by parsing the XML response. Then I'm going to go into an object called result, an object called leads, an object called row, and I'm going to grab the first, or I should say an array called a row, and I'm going to grab the first index of that, and then finally an object called FL and grab its first index. And essentially when I do this, then this is the result that I get back right here. I've actually returned this guy right here, and this is, it turns out, our lead ID. So again, I don't want to spend too much time on the actual parsing part, but just know that it all depends on what type of data you're getting back. If you're getting XML back, you're probably going to be doing something that's very similar to this. So that's getting data out. At this point, I should point out that if you had, for example, an individual lead value, maybe the name of some user, you could then simply use this as a pre-population for a text field. So for example, I have this customer name field right here. If I return my request properly, I can simply create a variable called, for example, name, and it could be equal to one of these XML properties. And then I could use name as the default value for this field by simply using one of our PHP tokens. So for example, if I created a PHP variable called name that held the name of the first lead right here, this lead from this XML request right here is going to show up in this text box. Now the other thing that you might want to do, and probably just as popularly, is write results to, in this case, Zoho CRM. So what does that actually look like? Well, to actually write a result right here, it's all going to depend on how your API expects data to come through. And so as an example of that right here, we have this insert record method. So again, just in case you didn't see this before, I simply found a method that sounded like I could actually write records to the CRM system, and I found one called insert records. I basically took this URL right here, I copied it, and pasted it into this text box right here. I then need to update it with my valid auth token. So just so we have that, so I'm going to do that. And then I took that record and I stripped out the last part, which is the part where it expects XML data right here. And I added a variable called XML data, which contains that data. Now I said a lot right there. Let me break it down piece by piece. So first things first, this API call right here is pretty standard. In fact, this is very similar to what we've already done, right? We have the URL part, the name of some action. We're kind of giving a few parameters. We're giving it the auth token, the scope, but we now have this new property called an XML data equals. So XML data equals is essentially the value that we're going to write into the API. And as you can see here, this is just regular old XML. It's a parent or a root item called leads, and it has a bunch of different properties that are built into it. So how would you actually go ahead building this? Because that's really what this is all about right here. All this stuff is pretty simple. We've already done it. But this XML data bit, that's what we're actually writing to. So the way I chose to do it is this. I created a code block element in RackForms, and I essentially did this. I created a here.doc element that has literally the exact same XML that we saw right here. Literally just took this guy, copied it, and pasted it into this right here. Then I stripped out all the new lines from it, and I saved it as, again, a PHP variable called $XML data. So XML data then, if you wanted to modify this with, say, like the form submission of a web form, I would put in tokens, or however I wanted to format this data so that your data is what's going in here. Now again, if you have any questions about that, please just shoot us an email. I don't want to get us bogged down with too many of these specific details, but just know here that we can customize this with any data that we have, for example, in a form submission on an earlier page. Anyway, I now have a variable called XML data. I can take XML data and I can use it as a field property for my variable. What's really important about this though is that the HTTP URL that I'm using here no longer includes this and XML data equals part. And I'm actually going to grab this right here and just kind of put this in just so you can see this. So this URL right here includes everything except the XML data part. And the reason why is because XML data is really hard to post inline with a web request. In fact, it's almost always going to fail. So instead what we do is we use an HTTP post, and instead of trying to pluck the XML data into the request, for example, XML data equals, and then literally just having that XML string in there, what we do is we chop that guy off and we let RackForms put that in for us. And the way we let it put it in for us is by literally creating a variable that has the exact same name as that property. So the property is XML data, the name slash property, and then RackForms at runtime is going to take this bit right here, and it's going to turn this into the post part of your request. And therefore, you don't have to worry about any of the formatting. You just need to give the exact same format that the API expects it to come in, modify it again with any dynamic variables that you had from a form submission, and then just put it as the variable in here. Again, the key to this, though, is this has to be the same as the variable right here. So, for example, if I wanted to change the scope of this, I could have scope as a variable right here, but the name would literally, again, have to be the exact same as this name right here. If XML data was even slightly off, like a lowercase d, this is not going to work. It has to be the exact same name, punctuation, etc. At any rate, when we do that then, when we push this through, we'll actually modify our request here, because I actually had when we ran this the first time, we actually inserted a record already. But basically, I'm going to go through right here, and I'm going to just run this. And we run the API, by the way, ooh, invalid ticket ID. Actually, this is good. So actually, that's really good. It's really good that we actually got some data back. So here's basically what happens. If we run into an error, which will often happen when we're getting it up and running with an API, it's going to be really helpful to show debug info. So I'm going to try to run this again here. And notice that right now I'm returning this invalid ticket ID text. But the only reason that's happening is because we're in a non-production environment and I'm echoing out the response using the same logic that I did for this guy, right? I'm just kind of taking the response object and then printing it out. But you're never going to do this in production. And so what you're going to end up with instead is just a blank page. It's you don't know if something worked or it didn't work. So that's why it's always nice to be able to turn on debugging info right here and see if you get any error messages in your output right here. So it's not always going to lead, for example, to the specific error message, but you can at least see what you posted to the system. Again, though, if you want the actual response message during your initial testing of the form, always just say echo response so you can see what the raw response is. And in this case, again, we're getting a message that basically says invalid ticket ID. Well, I know from experience that invalid ticket ID means that I did not update my API auth token. So let's just do that right here so that our auth token is right. And we'll try running this one more time. And now this should add. So I'm actually getting records added successfully. Gives me a timestamp as well. So I now know that because I got the that nice message right there, that I can actually go into my Zoho right here, and I can see that there indeed is that record that I just inserted to the API. And of course I could see it in leads, etc. right here. So that's basically it then. That is the and obviously we covered a lot here, but that is the core process of not only querying, but then also writing too. There's obviously a lot of technical skill involved in this right now. From when we're doing this manually. So please do not hesitate to ask any questions or follow-up items if some of this is not clear. Anyway, we'll look forward to any response that you have, and thanks as always for watching.